history instructor at the Academy, and a member of the committee planning for our 4-event Robin series. It's titled War on the Innocents, the Syrian Humanitarian Crisis. In 5 years, the Syrian civil war has claimed nearly 500,000 lives. Syria's wealth has all but been wiped out. Everyone suffers, but the innocents suffer most. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children have had their lives shattered and destroyed in a war with no end in sight. All sides in this brutal conflict attack the innocents indiscriminately using barrel bombs, high explosives, gas jars, assault rifles. The Islamic State beheads people. Syrians are hungry and cold. Public services are only a memory. Schools are shut. Medical care is primitive. Government forces have deliberately bombed hospitals and markets and bakeries. American airstrikes have killed civilians. For so many, there is no way out. Tonight's panel will explore the dimensions of the humanitarian crisis in Syria. It has spilled into Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, and Europe, with the arrival of tens of thousands of desperate migrants. It has spilled over, too, into the United States presidential campaign, with candidates calling for a ban on Muslims entering the country. Even in New Hampshire, there has been a call to close the state's borders to Syrian refugees. As I said, the impact of this war has fallen most heavily on the innocents and perhaps more heavily than most on children. And if you want to get a sense of how little kids have responded to this, there's a selection of drawings by Syrian children from refugee camps along the Turkish-Syrian border. If you have a chance on your way out, stop and look. They're quite moving. Just one last word, the symposium continues Thursday at 7 in the Assembly Hall with a panel discussion that will explore the political, diplomatic, and military ramifications of the Syrian civil war. The program concludes Friday morning with an assembly address by the Harvard scholar Tarek Massoud. Andy Hertig of the Academy's History Department will be the moderator tonight. Andy, will you introduce the panelists?
I will introduce the panel. Thank you. I'm a retired history teacher, brought back into service. Welcome to the panel. We are very fortunate this evening to have we are very fortunate this evening to have 3 experts about the Syrian refugees, and they have different types of expertise. The second panelist on my left is Melinda Negron-Gonzales. She's an assistant professor of political science at the Manchester campus of UNH. She's also the coordinator for their Politics and Society program. She's taught courses on comparative politics and international relations. And she has a special interest in Turkey. She had a Fulbright scholarship in Turkey in 2006 and 2007. And her research focuses on social movements, civil society, and democratization in Turkey. And since Turkey is a country with the most number of Syrian refugees and borders Syria, it's most appropriate that we have her expertise with us tonight. And our third panelist, on my far left, Liza Williams, is a PhD candidate in political theory and international relations at Brown University. Her dissertation is entitled Hospitality and the Horizons of Democracy, Responsibilities to Immigrants. And it develops a new ethical practice of hospitality and examines the reasons why liberal democratic democracies may have certain obligations to immigrants and other categories of non-citizens. She has a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth and a master's degree in political science from Columbia. She is currently an interdisciplinary opportunity fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown. And as a sort of footnote, I've known Liza for quite a while because she was a teaching intern in 2005 and 6 here at Exeter. She came back in 2007 and taught American history and European history. I'm very happy that we persuaded her to move away from law to teaching. So, before we begin, a word about the format. Each of the panelists will give a short presentation. I'm hoping that that part will be over in about half an hour, and then we'll be open the panel up to questions. So as you're listening to these talks and looking at the presentation, be thinking of questions that you'd like to ask. We'll try to save time for the questions. As you probably know, we academics tend to run on for quite a long time. When I tried to help my children with their history homework here at Exeter, they always said, "Dad, just give us the short answer." The organization here is to start with the personal and the refugee camps and the actual meetings with refugees. We're turning now to Melinda, who is going to talk about the effect on a neighboring country, and I also neglected to point out that you're the only one here with a Ph.D. from the University of Florida.
She's very close. I think I will use the microphone if you don't mind. Thank you. That's a tough act to follow. Thank you all for being here. So I am going to discuss the Syrian refugee crisis from a Turkish perspective, and I'm going to start by giving you some statistics and talking a little bit about Turkey's legal and institutional framework for dealing with asylum seekers, and talk about some of the challenges as well as some opportunities that exist currently in Turkey when looking at the refugee crisis. So Turkey is now the largest refugee hosting country in the world. At the moment, these are the latest figures that I was able to find, there are approximately 2.29 million refugees, excuse me, is that going out? In Turkey. They estimate that the actual number is more like 2.5, 2.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey alone. Above you can see one of the refugee camps, and the other photo here shows some refugees who have taken shelter basically on the sidewalk in Istanbul, in Turkey's largest city. And so right now you have about 275,000 Syrian refugees who are housed in camps, much of them in camps like this one here, with tents. Some of them are actually even nicer, and they have some prefab housing structures. And aside from those 275,000 Syrian refugees, the rest of the refugees in Turkey are scattered throughout the country, residing outside of camps. And so they've had to basically find their own housing. And as you can see in this photo, that means for many, living in the streets. So roughly 88 to 89% of the Syrian refugees in Turkey are actually living outside of camps. It's estimated that just in Istanbul alone, there's about 500,000 Syrian refugees living. This map gives you an impression of the scale of the problem within the Middle East region. It shows in yellow where some of the refugee camps are located in neighboring countries, and you'll see that many of the refugee camps in Turkey are right along the Turkey-Syria border. There aren't any refugee camps in the northern part of the country. They're all in the southern part, many of them very, very close to the Syrian border. I'm sorry. This gives you an idea of the scale of the problem, looking at Europe and where people are going. Okay. This next map shows you where the Syrian refugees are in Turkey. And so you see in southern Turkey the big yellow circles. Those are where the refugee camps are. But then you look at big cities in Turkey like Istanbul, Bursa, Izmir, Ankara. There are no refugee camps in those areas, yet you see that there's a sizable refugee population in each of those cities. So the big challenge for Turkey has been dealing with such a massive influx of refugees in a short period of time, because up until about 2014, the refugees that were coming across the border into Turkey were easily housed in these new refugee camps. And the Turkish government actually spent quite a lot of money putting together the best refugee camps out there. That's the word on the street.
That's true.
You've been, so yeah, she can attest to that. And once ISIS really began to start making gains in Syria, and you saw such a massive influx of refugees into Turkey, the situation sort of unraveled and got out of their hands, and there wasn't enough room in the refugee camps. So they allowed all of these people to come into the country knowing that they didn't have anywhere to actually place them. And so what the Turks have been doing is providing these Syrian refugees with a special status in Turkey as beneficiaries of what's called temporary protection. And basically the reason why these Syrian refugees are receiving this special status is because Turkey, though it is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, placed a reservation on that, and they have a geographical limitation to the Refugee Convention, so that only refugees going to Turkey from Europe are actually refugees and are covered under the convention. Any non-European people who travel to Turkey seeking asylum do not technically fall under Turkey's 1951 Refugee Convention. So the Syrians have been given this special status called temporary protection, whereby they are able to come into the country, they are not going to be forcibly removed, they have certain rights and privileges, they have access to healthcare, they have access to education, and recently there's been a move to make sure that they have access to work permits. And so Turkey has worked to put together a legal framework to deal with this massive influx of Syrian refugees. But interestingly enough, they've been putting together for the past decade or so a law to deal with asylum seekers in order to align their domestic laws with the European Union. Turkey is an official candidate country to the EU. And so before the refugee crisis in Syria, they had been working to align their domestic laws with European Union and international standards. But they were not ready for when the Syrians came rushing to the border into 2013 and 2014 in particular. And by 2015, early 2015, Turkey was receiving more Syrian refugees than Lebanon and Jordan. And so the new law that they put together went into effect in April of 2013. And this provides some of the additional protection for the Syrian refugees. Keep in mind that there are also Iraqi refugees coming into Turkey, and they fall under a different status called international protection, and they don't have access to the health care and the education that the Syrian refugees have access to. So Syrian refugees are being treated differently, and if there are any European refugees, which there are not to my knowledge, they would actually fall under the 1951 convention. So I just want to briefly talk about some of the challenges that the Syrian refugees have been facing in Turkey. Turkey, by all accounts, has been a gracious host, but it is not as wealthy as America or its European allies, and so it's really been struggling to provide access to health care, which is technically free for these Syrian refugees. There's a huge problem with the language barrier. People forget that Syrians and Turks do not speak the same language, not even close. And there are not very many people in Turkey who speak Arabic, for reasons that I may get into in the Q&A if you want to take the conversation down that road, but there are not a lot of Arabic speakers in Turkey. And so they're scrambling to find people who can serve as translators at hospitals. And this is also a problem with access to education, because these Syrian children could technically go to school, but they don't speak the language. And so what they've been trying to do is working through NGOs and various municipal agencies, put together some Turkish language courses and also put together some kind of parallel educational system so that these Syrian refugee children could actually continue to go to school. But that's not working too well at the moment. Overall, less than 1/3 of the 700,000 Syrian school-aged children who entered Turkey in the last 4 years are actually attending school. So the children who live in a refugee camp are able to access education and they have classes, but for all of those children who do not live in refugee camps, it's very difficult for them to continue their studies. And what they're finding is that oftentimes there's this issue of child labor where children are being exploited and basically have to be the breadwinner for the family because it's incredibly difficult for the parents to find work as well. Turkey just recently announced a provision for issuing work permits to Syrians. It remains to be seen how well that's going to work out. There are certain restrictions, and they've made a rule that the number of refugees working at any particular firm cannot exceed 10% of the employed Turkish citizens. And of course, there's the language barrier again. So the language barrier in my mind is perhaps one of the main obstacles for children and adults. And the status issue is, of course, problematic because Turkey doesn't really have a plan for integration. So they're assuming that at some point these people will be resettled somewhere else, Canada, Europe, somewhere, America, question mark. And they're allowed to stay until someone can figure out some kind of arrangement, but technically they're not able to enjoy that refugee status because of Turkey's geographical limitation on the Refugee Convention. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The number of refugees in Turkey is about equivalent to 3% of their population, which in the United States would be about 9 million people. And we're making a fuss about accepting 10,000 refugees. And Turkey has spent approximately 8 billion euros to accommodate this refugee flow. So you can see that this is probably not a sustainable sort of situation.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the impact and then raise a number of ethical quandaries that arise from looking holistically at the refugee crisis in Syria. And it's worth noting that the refugee crisis in Syria is only part of a larger worldwide displacement. Right now, there's about 60 million citizens that are homeless throughout the world, or they don't have citizenship. They're actually homeless. You might call them stateless. They're all different categories of migrants, and refugees are one part of that. And the Syrian refugees alone, they do account for the largest generational crisis since 1991 compared to other displacements. But we really are living in a historic time in terms of worldwide displacement. It's akin to or analogous to the situation during World War II and at the end of World War II. But actually the recorded numbers in World War II were about 50 million, so we're at 60 million global displacement, so it's really historic. And then I wanted to pick up on one thing that has been emphasized already in the talks, which is that the regional neighbors of Syria are really the ones who are shouldering a disproportionate amount of the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis. So Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt have received a vast majority of the refugees, with a much smaller percentage seeking asylum in Europe and more distant countries like the United States and Canada. And this is important because these countries are really resource poor in ways that the United States and Canada are not. And they also have real political instability within them. We could talk case by case, but Lebanon is a great example. You might have seen images on the news of garbage running through the streets of Beirut as they received recent rains. And this just signifies the absolute collapse of the infrastructure within some of these countries due to the immense influx of refugees from Syria. And you might wonder, I have this slide up here, you might wonder just generally, I don't understand the difference between asylum and resettlement. I'd just like to point out simply that there are two main mechanisms in the international refugee regime about how admissions are how they actually happen. So one option is resettlement, and this happens usually after a refugee has temporarily arrived in a host country, and usually under UN auspices, and then another country is willing to admit them for resettlement. And then the second mechanism for admissions possibility is asylum, which is protected under the Geneva Convention, which was first signed in 1951. The protocol that was signed in 1967 made it binding on states outside of Europe, and there are over 100 signatories to the Geneva Convention, and all of the countries in Europe and North America have signed, including Canada and the United States. So I wanted to point that out. So one of the ethical implications, which comes up right away, is just how do we classify who counts as a refugee? Who should get this status? And it's very politicized. So the Geneva Convention, one of the features of the definition in the Geneva Convention is that you have to be targeted specifically for either being part of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular group, or for expressing a certain political opinion. And the way that this has functionally operated is that, ironically, it often doesn't end up protecting people who have fled civil war. Now, UNHCR, which is the UN High Commission on Refugees, adopts a more expansive definition, which doesn't have this element of being targeted because of group membership or membership in a race, nationality, or political group. And then Article 14 of UDHR of 1948, it grants all persons the right to seek asylum, but it doesn't at all impose any kind of obligation for receiving states to actually extend refugee status. That happens as part of the state actually honoring the claim or validating the claim of who is a refugee. So I think that that's important, and that's a major dilemma that is raised, just who gets this status. So what's happened is that the migrants haven't actually just stayed in Turkey and Lebanon and within the region. They are on the move. So what happened in the summer and early fall of 2015 were that the migrants began moving en masse up through Greece and the Balkans and into the Schengen zone in Europe. And so Hungary was one of the first places that many refugees showed up. And the intensity of this really placed a large amount of pressure on the leaders in Hungary to decide what to do. And they very swiftly decided to close first in mid-September the Serbian-Hungarian border. They used violent methods to make sure that the Syrians stayed on the other side of the border. They erected a barbed wire fence really quickly to make sure that the Syrians didn't get into their territory. And then what you can see, these are some images of the refugees in the central train station in Budapest. It temporarily closed down transit in Hungary. And then you can see here where the first border closure happened in September. That's where they put up the barbed wire fence, which I have an image of. And then the migrants started seeking an alternative route through Croatia, which in mid-October was also shut down. So the magnitude in Europe has been really intense. As of December 2015, out of the nearly 4.7 Syrian refugees that are registered, there were nearly, a million asylum applications, which was up from 235,000 at the end of 2014. So it's a stunning growth, and experts project that at least 2 million more Syrians will leave Syria in 2016, and Europe is expecting at least 1 million, not just Syrian refugees, but at least 1 million more migrants from the Middle East and North Africa before the end of 2016. So, while German Chancellor Merkel has championed the cause of admitting Syrian refugees and other migrant arrivals, her case for hospitality and open borders has come under increasing challenge as opponents have sought to link asylum seekers with concerns about international terrorism. And there are serious security issues that need to be considered, both in terms of what we conventionally consider as terrorism, but also as became poignant after the New Year's Eve events of sexualized violence in Cologne and Dusseldorf and elsewhere throughout Germany. Merkel now faces the real possibility of losing her CDU ruling coalition, but the consequences for the union are more apparent in the deep fault lines that have emerged between the UK and Britain about how to treat asylum applicants and what the quotas that are going to be met are going to happen. The UK has really been resisting this, and it's pushed the question of Brexit, which is the possibility of Britain actually exiting the EU. And so David Cameron has really pushed to actually reduce the number of migrants that are getting into the UK, and he's also pushed to set the date for a referendum, a national referendum on the question of whether Britain will leave the EU. Right now, the date that's being posed is June 23rd. We'll see if that happens. But the failure within the EU to reach consensus about what to do about migrants has really exposed the many internal commitments to liberal values that exist within the post-World War II experiment of federalizing Europe. So there's also been deleterious effects on the Schengen zone. This is a map of the Schengen countries. The value at stake within Schengen is that you have free movement. So residents of the EU or those who hold visas can move throughout the borders. And since the migrant crisis has really enveloped Europe, you have a number of members to this agreement putting back in temporary border controls. So, after the Paris attacks happened, Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, and Sweden have reintroduced temporary border controls with other Schengen member states. So I think that that's important. So I want to get to the ethical issues that are presented in the refugee crisis. So the first question, big question, right? Big question is, do those of us who live in democratic states have a responsibility to admit refugees if they want to find a new home in one of our communities? And under what circumstances are we justified in refusing them entry? And I think that there's, at least 3 possible justifications that you could use to begin to build a case for why liberal democracies actually do have this moral commitment. And one could be just humanitarian concern. That's one possible line of justification. A second alternative is that liberal democracies, when they have causal connections to the events, to whatever precipitated events, then they do have some kind of duty to actually offer offer refuge for these people. And I think that there's, I mean, we could talk about it more, but you could directly link the United States to the instability in the Middle East if you wanted to, or many other liberal democracies. And then the third possible justification that you could use to say that liberal democracies do in fact have some kind of responsibility to these people is that you could look at the way that the sovereign state system is constructed. So one of the ways that sovereignty works in the interstate system is that there's this belief that everybody has a home in some sovereign place. But that's just not the case for refugees and other stateless people or migrants. So that is another way to generate some kind of normative argument for the fact that liberal democracies do in fact have a responsibility to refugees. We talked a little bit about who should be considered a refugee. That's a second overarching dilemma. And then the third ethical quandary that is at stake is what is owed to refugees once they've arrived. Do they deserve a permanent home or a temporary home? What kinds of benefits are they going to need? Should they be given jobs? Should they be given education for their children? Should they be given language training or medical care? And then another area that you could consider in terms of ethics is you could look at, and this is, I think this is the most important of the ethical dilemmas, but how should refugees be allocated between states? And I mean, that's really what's going on right now, is that the regional neighbors in Syria are really doing most of the work, and in many cases they aren't as well equipped to do that. So if you look at the numbers, you know, the neighbors are the ones that are offering refuge, whereas the United States, by the end of the year, you know, Obama's plan was to resettle 10,000, and the UN High Commission on Refugees has called for the United States to settle 130,000 in the next 2 years. And that wouldn't at all, you know, be what the limit that the United States could deal with, but it would at least begin to alleviate some of the pressure on regional neighbors. So, and then I think the last one is also important. Like, what are the limits to our obligations to refugees? And if so, if there are limits, we need to be able to articulate them very clearly. So I have a few more minutes. I have a whole view that could actually make an argument for why democratic principles themselves are actually fully capable of generating protections for non-citizen residents, including refugees. And these principles, you could talk about self-authorship, pluralism, and experimentalism as part of the principles that would actually put forward a democratic commitment. I don't think that you have to rely on any kind of commitment to human rights discourse in order to do the work. I'm not going to spend very much time on that, but I want to talk about, I have 2 minutes, right? 2?
Quickly.
Okay. I want to talk about what you can do. So you can do all sorts of things to help refugees and bear your burden. So one of the things is that elected leaders have unusual discretion. So you can actually go and talk to your elected leaders and put pressure on them. They have resources, and the tone of their response can be decisive. All you have to do is you could look at Angela Merkel's discourse and see how effective it has been in contrast to you know, Hungarian leaders. And you can get involved in an NGO or a nonprofit organization. And individually, you can be hospitable to Syrian refugees. There are, I'm sure, Syrian refugees that you might meet in the next couple of years, and you can be an individual ally for their causes. So there's all sorts of established refugee organizations that you could get involved in. There are, you know, faith-based organizations, smaller grassroots organizations that you can become a part of, and these are all often very effective. So I just wanted to say that, and by saying, like, this is really close to home, like, you guys are in a state right now where the governor has called for limitations and obstruction against federal programs to resettle refugees. And you're not alone in New England. In fact, there's at least 31 governors who have moved to obstruct federal programs, but you can lobby your governors and you can lobby your elected officials to make changes because they are capable of it. And I'll end there. But thank you very much.
Clearly, the obligations, or the sense of obligation to take in refugees is a very subjective phenomenon. We're talking about some of the most liberal countries in the world, in Europe, and the number of refugees that they've taken compared, as Liza's pointed out, compared to the neighboring countries is really pretty small. If you look at Jordan, they are taking in about almost 10% of their population are refugees, and this is, it's a monarchy, it's not a full-fledged democracy, and they're doing a tremendous amount. And Lebanon, which is very, as has been pointed out, a very unstable country, is taking in over 1 million refugees, which is roughly equivalent to a third of their population. So these people, I don't know what sense of obligations they're feeling, but it's obviously quite different from what the people in Hungary are. Hungary is taking in the equivalent of 0.7% of its population, about 780-something thousand refugees. So it obviously varies a lot, and it depends on what people in the countries feel. And you see the great the feelings against immigrants in the United States today as a manifestation of this sort of sentiment. Well, we are open for questions. We have about 10 minutes before lower class people have to get back to their dorms, but we can stick around afterwards too for more questions. But do we have questions from the audience?
Who lives in Hamburg, Germany, and they have felt very much the number of migrants who have come to Germany, and he said he was amazed at how wonderfully Germans have responded. But after what happened during Christmas, with some, I don't know quite how to describe it, but anyway, unpleasant actions toward women, he said the one thing that we didn't think of was culture. And it seems to me that there is a tremendous problem with language. And I wonder if maybe they would just teach all these poor kids one language that would take them everywhere. But the other problem is the cultural one. And I think that might possibly be a big problem in this country because there is a lot of anti-Muslim thinking here. So I think that's a big, stubborn thing and that would make it more difficult.
So you kind of mentioned democratic principles as a kind of foundation of the kind of moral responsibility towards refugees. But we're seeing in kind of Hungary, especially with the Orban administration.
Talking to the mic.
The Orban administration in Poland with kind of law and order winning the last elections, and even in kind of America with certain Republican candidates, with this kind of rhetoric going around. My question is, how do you kind of reconcile the fact that there are democratic peoples voting in elections in Europe that are voting largely for anti-immigrant parties, and how does that square with the idea that democracy is or democratic principles at least are the best way forward to deal with refugees as a moral issue?
That's a question for you guys.
So one of the ways that I would put this to you is that it's certainly the case that democracies might have foundational values or some kind of identity, right? But I also think, and this is my view, and you might disagree with me, but there's also uncertain aspects of identity that aren't fully determined from the beginning of the founding of a people or even over time. So I think there are uncertain aspects that are never capable of being fully defined. Even though there might be values that a collective people hold, they're not fully determined. So I don't think that a sovereign people or a popular sovereign, right, a democratic people, the demos, that that means that authorizes a right to exclusion. So a people might know who they are, but that doesn't necessarily point to their right to exclude. So I also think that democracy has a very strong value in experimentalism or the possibility for change over time, and always leaving open the horizons of how it could be that people could live well together. So I think that's a core part of democracy too. Not only self-authorship, which isn't fully determined, but also a value in never fully closing the boundaries around what constituent power is or what it could mean or the ways that a people collectively could live together well.
Kind of this long-term thinking about democracy as a fundamentally kind of a good thing for refugees and for anybody trying to come to the country. But this is a short-term issue, and in the short term we have seen the liberal kind of parties come to power in Poland and kind of Eastern Europe. So how does kind of democracy work with these ideals of kind of protecting refugees when you have governments in power, democratic governments in power, that are opposed to the, in various degrees of, support xenophobia or in various degrees of anti-Muslim sentiment?
Well, I mean, there you're just, the contradiction is there in the question, right? They are affirming illiberal values. So whatever you're calling the government on its face might not actually be the case. So if you have a government that is espousing illiberal values and is putting into place values and practices and policies that don't actually instantiate those liberal values, then it would be hard-pressed to call it a liberal democracy, even though it might have been so at a different point in history.
If I can build on that question, it seems to me that it's probably unrealistic to expect many of these countries to change their attitude and become very welcoming, and given the dimensions of the problem, with millions of people applying for asylum in these countries. So I have a question, I guess, for the panel. Is the way to work on this to see if you can change that attitude so they welcome more people? Or is there some other strategy that would be more effective to solve this problem so that there aren't floods of refugees coming to these countries? Yes, please.
I think part of the problem is that the refugees have been framed as a security threat, and so you have the politics of freer taking over in Europe and also in America. You see this on the campaign trail all the time, where there is this narrative out there that refugees could be dangerous terrorists. And so I think that has really led to the growth of this illiberal stance in the US and also in Europe. And I don't know how we get past that other than just pointing to the fact that refugees are not terrorists, and the people who went around shooting people in cafes in Paris and carrying out other acts of terrorism in Europe are not refugees. I teach a terrorism class at UNH, and I can't tell you how many times students bring up what they hear on TV or on the radio, and they are convinced that refugees are indeed a security threat, and people are genuinely afraid. And I think until we have strong leadership in North America and in Europe that points out the distinction between these refugees who are escaping ISIS and ISIS, then we won't be able to really move forward.
The education systems, and I know there's been great success as well in Sweden, especially when they're a minority of the population. Is there a way to avoid perhaps a ghettoization of Syrians when they reach Europe and when they just sort of integrate them more into Europe?
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, one way you could, when refugees are not secure in their status or their level of protection, right? When anybody feels insecurity, right, your natural impulse is to hide or to stay on the margins, right, or the periphery. So I think one thing that's really key to foster in order to make incorporation happen successfully and to prevent ghettoization is to give non-citizen residents, including refugees, visibility and voice. They need democratic spaces of political activity in order to actually say what they need and say what they can do, right? And say what they want to have happen, right? in incorporation debates or multicultural debates. So I think voice, visibility, and building spaces of democratic, democratic activity is really important in order to make sure that these populations don't become ghettoized.
I would just add that is true also for Turkey. However, the challenge in Turkey is that Turkey is not a liberal democracy yet. They're working really hard, and they've made some strides, and in recent years they've progressed. But civil society in Turkey is not as robust as it is in the Scandinavian countries or in the U.S. And so, giving the Syrian guests, as they're called, because they're not technically refugees, giving the Syrian guests voice and making sure that there's accountability is incredibly important. But the Turkish government needs to be careful because there was an earthquake in Van in southeast Turkey as the refugees were coming into Turkey, and some people were displaced. You had an internal displacement problem because of the earthquake in southeastern Turkey, and those were Turkish citizens, and they were housed in tents. And people began to express dissatisfaction with the fact that the Turkish citizens were housed in tents while the Syrians were housed in these prefab housing structures that had AC and were very nice. And so the people of Van started to argue that they didn't have a voice and the government was not responding to their needs, but somehow the government was responding more to the needs of the Syrian refugees. And so, in Turkey, there's the challenge of not having a liberal democracy in place to begin with, so that, it will be difficult for the Syrian refugees, particularly those who are not in camps, to really express themselves and be heard by the municipal governments or by the national government when ordinary Turkish citizens don't have that privilege. So that's a challenge.
Well, and the problem of ghettos is more complicated than perhaps we indicated. In the United States in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, when large numbers of immigrants came, they lived in communities which reinforced, were supportive. They spoke the same language. It gave people a chance to learn the language. And there were jobs. They eventually took over city governments, and there were jobs available. But the key point is what happens next. Do they get integrated into the society? Do they get jobs? Do they get recognition? And European countries don't have a great record of integrating people who weren't natives. In Germany, there were guest workers, Turks, who came in the 1960s, and they're still considered Turks, not Germans. Whereas in this room, there are probably lots of people whose grandparents or parents came here and are considered to be American citizens and have been integrated into the system. I say this at the same time that we have a good deal of anti-foreign sentiment right now in the country, perhaps because we have the largest percentage of foreign-born in the country now, at about the same percentage as we had at the beginning of the 20th century when the system was strained. So the point is, I guess, in this respect, that at some level, you get to a point where the people in the country figure that they can no longer welcome people. And it's amazing to me that the countries in the Middle East, which are perhaps illiberal, are less liberal than Europe, are the ones that are actually doing the most.
The children of the Turkish laborers in Germany can choose to be German citizens when they reach age 18.
Oh yeah, they can.
And I've met some, so many of their parents went back to Turkey because they were given, I think, 30,000 D-marks at the time to repatriate to Turkey and establish businesses there. But very often their children stayed in Germany.
But are they
So
considered...
there is a certain amount of integration going on.
That's true.
Sorry.
Are they considered Germans?
So I've noticed that the de facto argument employed by many right-wing figures and ideologues in Europe against refugee migration has been, I guess, the inability to reconcile cultural differences between Muslims and Western and those in Western civilization, which I believe is untrue. But I was just wondering, what role do you all think that cultural assimilation programs and policies play, or should play, when resettling refugees in Europe, because as you mentioned regarding Turks and Moroccans in Western Europe, historically there have been these programs, and they've been implemented with relative success, but I was just wondering if this is different or if there's a comparison to be made.
The question is whether, if I understood it correctly, was whether programs in Europe that have been designed to try and integrate cultures, to get one culture to understand the other, whether they're working or not, or whether they are not successful. Is that right?
Well, yeah, well that, and also if programs like that should be implemented, I guess especially rigorously regarding the crisis, because a lot of the arguments employed by right-wingers is that there's no way to reconcile Islamic culture and Western culture, and whether or not these programs can help to fix that.
Okay. Everybody understand the question?
I mean, one way to begin to respond to that, and that's a huge question in multicultural debates, is like, what values, are synergistic, right? But, the premise is wrong, though. Like, there's no reason to believe at the beginning that Western values are irreconcilable with whatever set of values is being referred to as Muslim values. Exactly. So I think the premise is not particularly good. I mean, there's all sorts of scholars who talk about what Muslim values are and how they are in fact compatible with liberal values. And then I think that we shouldn't be fearful or hasty in concluding that there is some kind of irreconcilable tension just if there is debate. So I think contentious debate is part of a path towards resolution. So I think that in these programs where there are passionate disagreements about what should be done, like the headscarf affair in France, right? I mean, most people know that. That's a debate over whether cultures are reconcilable, and it's a debate that comes out of incorporation. And I don't think these are beyond liberal democratic communities to solve. So.
I have the mic over here.
One point I'd just like to add is that when I was growing up, people referred to the United States as a melting pot, but now the appropriate metaphor is a salad bowl, where you have different pieces that are distinctly separate, but they're all together to make the salad. And I think we've become a little bit more sensitive about the importance of people preserving their cultural identity without necessarily being considered in pejorative terms.
So my question is directed towards Ms. Chen. Earlier you were speaking about the unfortunate adversities that younger people who grow up in these war-torn countries face. And so my question, I guess, is for those who still have families, how does the lure or perhaps the attempted recruitment of ISIS affect the family dynamic or relationship?
I'm not as informed about the Syrian conflict as I should be, so this might not be the best question, but it seems to me that while as important and as tragic as the Syrian refugee crisis is, it's a symptom of a larger problem, which is, of course, the civil war and the Assad regime in Syria. And given the resistance to accepting refugees that has been shown by a lot of European and Western countries, is there any way to mitigate the conflict in Syria and return these Syrians to their homes?
That's a good segue to the Thursday night panel discussion, which is talking about the Syrian conflict, because clearly, given the dimensions of the problem and the fact that most of these people would like to go home, the solution would be seen to end the conflict and create a situation where they can go home. And the panel discussion on Thursday night, I think, will be addressing some of that question. Because there's all kinds of complications. One could argue that the Russians, in trying to create stability with Assad, are creating conditions where people can go home. They claim that about a third of the Syrian people were against Assad, a third before, and a third was kind of neutral. But after the chaos erupts, more and more people would say, for goodness sakes, if we could just have stability, electricity, running water, and not people bombing us, that would be enough. So I don't know where that leaves democracy, because obviously if Assad stays or if his regime stays, there won't be democracy. But come Thursday night and maybe we'll get the answer.
Can I just say a few things? I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but the conflict is so complex now. It's so much more than a civil war. It's a proxy war, and that complicates everything. And so the Russians and the Americans need to figure out their part of the deal, and then you need to get the Assad regime and the various rebel factions to figure out their part of the story, and then the Turks are angry at everyone at the table, and so there's supposed to be a ceasefire that will go into effect on Saturday, and most analysts are pretty skeptical that it'll stick. And in a situation when it seems like one side has a chance of winning, or at least has the perception that they could win, there's no incentive for them to compromise and to come to the negotiating table. And right now, the Assad regime is doing okay thanks to the Russians. So they're coming to the negotiation table with a very strong hand, and there's a good chance that they could continue to delay talks as they capture more territory and come out with the upper hand. And so in my opinion, I don't think it looks good in the short term for the conflict to end anytime soon.
I read an article just recently by an analyst who had studied civil wars in general, was drawing on literature and studied civil wars in general, and said that 70% of them are settled only when one side wins. In other words, if you have a negotiated settlement and the power is sort of evenly distributed, it just puts the conflict on hold and it flares up again. Now, I don't know who would the winner be now. It certainly looks as though it might be Assad with the Russians. Another point about the family dynamic point, this is not entirely related to it, but I was reading an account of the initial demonstrations in Hama against Assad, and the people were out in the streets unified, Christians, Alawites, Sunnis, arm's length for freedom. And what happened was that Assad turned his thugs loose, and they were Alawites, and they were beating up Sunnis, and so pretty soon, you know, if your relative or your brother or whatever had been killed by an Alawite thug, then your religion became important, or your identity became important, and Assad has consciously exacerbated conflicts which were not a big deal before.
Hello. So my question is, does America owe Syrian refugees simply because they play a part, good or bad, in the war?
Oh, what? I'm sorry.
In the war.
Well, I mean, I think that one point to make, which I guess is a point to take away, is that refugee policy is foreign policy. And clearly the United States, as one of the world powers, maybe you might even argue the global hegemon, but has some kind of duty to construct a sound foreign policy. And right now the United States needs a much better foreign policy in its relationship to Syria, and other global powers need to really rethink what their actual strategic aims are and what they are trying to get out of the Syrian civil war. Because right now it's a civil war that's turned into, you could say, a pseudo world war, right? It has global dimension. So if refugee policy is part of foreign policy, we need to make sure that we're getting that right. And although you might make an argument that in the short term it's okay for the regional neighbors to shoulder a disproportionate number of the Syrian refugees, it certainly is not a long-term policy that could be considered just. So I think the United States, Europe, and other global powers really need to rethink what their foreign policy is, what the main strategic objectives are, and how refugee policy is inextricable from foreign policy goals.
So I have a question based off of the point Ms. Chen made about how ISIS does recruit certain refugees to pay them to like fight for them. I was wondering, so obviously then terrorist groups would be infiltrating refugee camps, and I was wondering like what could be done to prevent this kind of security issue.
I'm not sure exactly, but refugees coming to the United States, for instance, are vetted over a two-year period. The real problem, the real threat to the United States, if there is a threat from foreigners coming, are people coming from, there's something like 31 million people a year who come from countries which don't require, where we don't require a visa. So if you're a terrorist, you go to France, and then you get on a plane and you fly to the United States. You don't have to wait for a two-year vetting process. They're trying to tighten those regulations up now, so that if you've been to a country like Syria in the last year, you now have to get a visa to get in, or will. But the refugees are, in Europe maybe it's more of a problem because there are fewer controls on their movement, but even so, I think the point's been made that most of these people are fleeing from dreadful conditions.
I understand that. I'm just saying that there are terrorist movements that are like targeting these people who are vulnerable mentally, psychologically in these refugee camps, like within Turkey and within Lebanon, and how can, like, I think that's a security issue that's not addressed as much within those countries, and I was just wondering like what you guys thought could be done about this issue.
I mean, one way to solve the problem. So if there are these camp spaces that are, a focus of terrorist infiltration, one thing you would do is move quickly and swiftly to get migrants and refugees out of these camp spaces and actually allow them to arrive in a country where they can apply for asylum. So the quicker that we can get persons out of the camp spaces and tent settlements, this is going to be a really good thing. And Andy is completely right that once you actually arrive in a space and apply for asylum, you open yourself up to intense levels of scrutiny that will last multiple years. So if you have any kind of connection with terrorist organizations, that's going to be discovered very quickly in the process of deciding whether your asylum claim is valid. So I would say in order to deal with this problem of terrorists targeting these very vulnerable people in camp spaces, that we need to get these people out of camp spaces as swiftly as possible.
And I think your question illustrates what stake other countries, in the United States too, has in this conflict. Because when you have this amount of instability and people living in refugee camps, you're going to get, you may get their recruiting ground, petri dishes for extremists. And we have a stake in ending this situation.
I would just add that since Turkey is hosting most of these people more than any other country, and most of them are not in refugee camps, it's difficult to control what happens among the people, the Syrian refugees, when they're not actually in camp. So these are sort of two separate issues that are connected, but it's a challenge for the Turks to keep an eye on everything that's going on and making sure that everyone is receiving the right psychosocial support when they're not in a camp. About 89% of them are not actually in camps in Turkey.
A question. I mean, the fact that young people are suicide bombers and blowing themselves up, which is totally against what Islam teaches about suicide. I mean, think of you as young people. Can you imagine choosing to blow yourself up as an option for something better than what you were doing? You'd have to be pretty desperate to do that. And so correcting that environment that creates that sense of desperation is crucial.
That's a point, a little bit. So I actually did my research project last term in contemporary Middle East class on ISIS and recruitment. So actually a large percentage of the people who go to Islamic State because of desperation don't actually become soldiers, but they just simply live there and receive the kind of aid that Islamic State gives them, the bare minimum that they cannot receive otherwise. So a large percentage of people could go there because of those reasons. And what I was wondering is, I also read about cases in which people do go to ISIS and join the fight, join the Islamic State army, but then they realize that the kind of sentiment, spirit that they imagined wasn't really reflected in the army. And there are news, stories, reports about those people confessing about their experience. But I'm wondering, do you think that will actually help discouraging people from going to ISIS? Or, as Ms. Chen mentioned earlier, it will be more effective to put in more, mental guidance from, say, NGOs or other kind of organizations to actually solve the problem from a more fundamental, psychological, addressing it in a psychological way.
For one more question,
This is directed to Ms. Chen. So how are psychological services or any sort of healing process offered to refugees who survive on the bare minimum or are starving? How are NGOs reaching them, and how are they given any sort of kind of reconciliation?
all right. So come on Thursday and maybe you'll find out how to end the war.